The evening crowd was buzzing inside the city's most luxurious restaurant, where crystal chandeliers sparkled like stars, and every table seemed to host someone important. Waiters moved swiftly, serving dishes that cost more than an average week's salary. Then, the door opened quietly, and a woman in a plain floral dress stepped inside. Her shoes were worn, her purse small, and her expression soft yet confident. She didn't look like she belonged there, and that's exactly what caught everyone's attention. The hostess at the front gave her a polite but doubtful look. Other guests glanced up from their plates, whispering behind their napkins. A few laughed quietly, assuming she had lost her way. But the woman simply smiled and asked for a table for two, her tone calm and kind. When she mentioned she had a reservation, the hostess hesitated, clearly thinking there must be some mistake. As she walked further in, the whispers grew louder. A group of young women at a nearby table started mocking her clothes, while one man chuckled and said, "This isn't a charity hall." Still, she didn't flinch. She sat down gracefully, her eyes wandering to the grand piano in the corner, as if she was lost in thought. Minutes passed. The waiters ignored her. The laughter got bolder, and the humiliation hung heavy in the air. But just when it seemed she might quietly get up and leave, the restaurant doors opened again. This time, a tall man in a tailored suit entered, someone everyone recognized instantly. The chatter stopped. Phones came out. The billionaire who owned half the city was here, and when he walked straight toward that simple woman and gently kissed her forehead, the entire restaurant fell silent. Every head in the restaurant turned as the billionaire placed his hand on the woman's shoulder. The same waiters who had ignored her now froze in shock. The hostess who had doubted her stood speechless. The man smiled warmly at his wife and said softly, "Sorry, I kept you waiting." His tone carried a mix of love and respect that no amount of money could buy. But behind that calm smile, his eyes had already noticed how everyone had treated her. The whispers started again. But this time they were different. Some guests murmured in disbelief. Others tried to hide their embarrassment. The woman, still quiet, simply looked around. Her eyes filled not with anger, but something deeper, perhaps disappointment. She wasn't there to show off or seek revenge. She had only wanted a peaceful dinner with her husband, yet the world's obsession with appearances had turned it into a spectacle. As they sat down, the billionaire pulled out her chair himself, ignoring the staff who now scrambled to serve them. Plates and glasses clattered as waiters rushed to make up for their earlier behavior. But it was too late. The damage had already been done. The woman spoke softly. "I told you we could have eaten anywhere." He smiled faintly and replied, "They needed to see you." His words carried a mystery she couldn't quite understand, but the seriousness in his voice made her pause. People nearby tried to overhear their conversation, pretending to look at menus or sip their drinks. A sense of unease spread across the room. No one knew who this woman really was, or why someone so powerful loved her so deeply. But as the lights dimmed and music began to play, it was clear the night was far from over. The soft notes of the piano filled the air, but the tension at their table lingered. The billionaire's calm presence made everyone uneasy. The same manager who had once looked down on the woman now stood nearby, smiling nervously and offering complimentary wine. The woman politely declined, her voice steady but distant. Her husband's eyes stayed on the staff, silently observing every move. It wasn't anger. It was something colder, something that made even the most confident waiter tremble. At another table, a young journalist recognized the man instantly. She had written about his recent charity projects and his mysterious past. Seeing him with a woman dressed so simply sparked her curiosity. She discreetly pulled out her phone and started taking notes. Who was this woman who could silence a whole restaurant with her presence? Meanwhile, in the kitchen, the head chef scolded his team for ignoring her earlier. Rumors began to spread among the staff. Some said she was a former teacher. Others claimed she had saved the billionaire's life years ago. Everyone had a version, but no one knew the truth. The woman finally looked up at her husband and said softly, "You didn't have to come." He leaned closer, his voice almost a whisper. "I always come when someone disrespects what I value most." His words sent a quiet chill across the room. The journalist caught that moment, her heart racing. She knew there was a bigger story hidden behind their calm faces. Something about love, power, and the thin line between pride and prejudice. As the night grew darker, the restaurant seemed to hold its breath. Every person there felt they were witnessing something more than just a dinner. It was a silent lesson, and it had only just begun. Just as the room began to settle into uneasy silence, the restaurant doors opened again. A man in an expensive suit walked in, his expression sharp and confident. The moment his eyes met the billionaire's table, a flicker of recognition passed between them, followed by tension so thick it seemed to silence even the music. The newcomer was Adrian Hale, a powerful investor and longtime rival of the billionaire. Everyone in the business world knew their history. Once partners, now bitter enemies. Adrian's smirk grew as he glanced at the woman sitting beside the billionaire. "Didn't expect to see you here, Elena," he said casually, his voice loud enough for nearby tables to hear. The woman stiffened. Her name echoed through the room, and the journalist's fingers flew over her phone screen. The billionaire's gaze hardened. "You've said enough," he warned. But Adrian only chuckled. "I just find it interesting," Adrian continued, "how a man who owns a dozen luxury brands is married to someone who used to. Well, never mind." The implication hung heavy in the air. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The woman's calm eyes flickered with pain, but she didn't respond. Her husband stood slowly, his presence alone enough to make Adrian falter for a brief second. Before he could speak, the journalist's camera flashed. The moment was captured. Two powerful men, one quiet woman, and an entire room watching a story unfold. The staff held their breath, unsure whether to intervene or disappear. Adrian smiled again, pretending not to care. "Some people never change," he muttered, turning toward the bar. But beneath the surface, something far deeper was unraveling. The truth about who Elena really was, and why her husband had brought her here tonight, was about to change everything. The billionaire's eyes never left Adrian's face. The entire restaurant felt frozen in time as tension crackled between the two men. Finally, he said in a steady voice, "You've always been good at talking, Adrian, but maybe tonight you should let the truth speak instead." He turned to his wife, his tone softening. "Elena, it's time they knew why we're here." Elena stood slowly, her calmness returning like a quiet storm. "I used to work here," she said, her voice clear and steady. "Years ago, I was a waitress in this very restaurant. I served people who looked through me, who thought kindness was weakness." Gasps spread across the tables. One night, a man walked in, polite, quiet, and nothing like the others. I didn't know he was a billionaire. He treated me with respect when no one else did. She looked toward her husband. "That man changed my life." The staff who had mocked her now lowered their eyes in shame. The manager stepped back, realizing who she had insulted earlier. Adrian's smug expression faded, but the billionaire wasn't done. "You see," he said, his voice firm, "I bought this restaurant last month. Tonight was its reopening, and I wanted the people who serve here to remember that wealth doesn't define worth." The entire room fell silent. Waiters stood still, guests whispered, and the journalist stopped recording, realizing this was more than a story. It was a lesson. Then came the final twist. Elena smiled faintly and turned to Adrian. "And you, Adrian," she said softly, "you were the one who fired me back then. Maybe fate wanted you to see me again, this time from a different table." Adrian's face went pale. The billionaire reached for her hand, and together they walked out, leaving behind a room full of silence and reflection. As Elena and her husband stepped out of the restaurant, the night air felt calm, almost cleansing. The flashing lights from the windows behind them slowly faded, but the silence they left inside was louder than any words spoken that evening. Guests sat quietly, their laughter gone, replaced by an uneasy reflection of how easily they had judged someone based on appearance. Even the journalist, who had been eager for a scandal, closed her notebook and whispered, "Maybe this story isn't about wealth, it's about worth." Inside, the manager gathered her staff, her voice trembling as she told them to remember what had happened. The waiters, who had laughed only an hour ago, stood ashamed, realizing how their behavior had exposed their own smallness. The restaurant that had once represented luxury now carried a different kind of value, respect and humility. Outside, The billionaire gently took Elena's hand. "You handled that with more grace than I ever could," he said. She smiled softly. "I didn't need to prove them wrong. I just needed them to see." They walked down the quiet street together, not as a billionaire and his wife, but as two people who had built something stronger than status, dignity. Later that night, photos of the evening began to circulate online. But instead of gossip, the headlines read differently. "Simple woman teaches a lesson in grace at luxury restaurant." The story touched millions, reminding people that true elegance has nothing to do with clothes or money. It lives in how you treat others. As the city lights shimmered above them, Elena glanced back once, then smiled and looked forward. She had come full circle, not to relive the past, but to show how far kindness and quiet strength could go. And that, perhaps, was her greatest victory of all.